Welcome, everyone. We're at 3:45, so I think we'll get started. First, thank you to folks for joining us. If you're not sure where you're at, this is one of the engagement sessions, a panel discussion called Filling the Gap, Integrating Forest Health Data Streams to Produce Holistic Assessments. I want to start by thanking, I'm Dave Bell from the Pacific Northwest Research Station. I'm one of the organizers and the moderator. I also want to note Eric Sprague and Sarah Goking, the other organizers of the session. This was really paired with our previous oral session on forest health topics. This and the other session both arose, if you heard Eric's points, arose out of conversations we had at an FHM workshop in Davis, California earlier this year, and really an attempt to bring in, three people we really respect, Randy Morin, Margaret Evans, and Frank Koch, to give their take on really two questions that's going to motivate the session. What are the untapped opportunities for integrating FIA and FHM expertise and data, and how can we overcome any limitations constraining such collaborations? We're going to start with each of them is going to have 5 minutes to sort of walk through their thoughts and musings on those questions, and then we're going to open the floor up to questions and really try and have a broader conversation. So questions, comments, a variety of things, and really this is an attempt to sort of reinvigorate this conversation about the integration of, or the Venn diagram of work that is forest monitoring between forest health monitoring and FIA. So with that, Randy is gonna start us off, and then Margaret, and then Frank. And so Randy, I'm gonna hand it off to you.
Thanks for the invite, Dave. Some of the things I'm going to mention here, I think actually got mentioned in the previous session. So, but we'll get right into it here if I can get my slides to go. So I think it was during Frank's presentation that he harkened back to the old beginning of FIA FHM relationship. Forest health monitoring really began in the 1980s in New England. It kind of grew out of the North American Maple Project, at least parts of it, in particular the Crown Health variables that were originally sampled in those FHM and moved over to FIA in 1999 when the FHM field methods were integrated into FIA. I think it was in the mid 90s, maybe 92, that Chip Scott was the publisher of the original 4 subplot design that FIA still uses today, and that was used in the original FHM monitoring plots. And everybody's seen this diagram a million times today. You might not be able to read this text, but all the different health indicators are sampled on these different parts of the FIA plot design, and those made up approximately 1/16 of the sample of FIA once the annual FIA began in 1999 and kind of slowly built out across the country. In 2002, FHM and FIA put out this pamphlet of all the different forest health indicators that FIA was collecting. And at that time, we were doing things like, just making maps by ecoregion of some of these different indicators. The main ones are listed out here, pretty familiar to everyone in this group. I just have asterisks next to the ones that were on that P3. We called P3 the 1/16 sample. A couple of them, like tree damage and tree mortality, are actually measured on all FIA plots, and I think have been across all the regions. A little bit more about the history. In about 2012, FIA began to kind of tinker with some of these P3 variables. We built what we call a new system, and in our northern region we call it P2 plus. I'm not sure that was consistent across FIA, but we wanted to make these variables and suites of health indicators more flexible by allowing for more spatial temporal variability, where maybe you're going to go up to 1/4 of the plots for some of these indicators depending on what your region is most interested in. So it started to kind of diverge or change across national FIA where there was differences in the regions on what indicators were being collected and at what intensity. In 2020, we made another brochure that kind of gave an update on all these different indicators, and also added some new ones such as invasive plants, regeneration and browse impact, and fragmentation and landscape context. Again, the ones with the asterisks were sampled on this subset of plots. In the north, we at one point had a goal of making all these up to 1/4 of the plots, but we never quite got there. And again, the fragmentation one is more like an every plot thing because it's a remote sensing combined application. And this map here just highlights what happens when we in FIA do something regionally that we have to make a map that stops at the border, where we know if we're looking at deer browsing impacts, then those impacts are felt across the north-south border. So as a national program, it's the more we can make these metrics available across the country, the better off the program will be. So I just want to finish up with challenges and opportunities. It's sort of a slide that has the same thing, but one from a challenge perspective and one from an opportunity perspective. We have a couple different types of challenges here. We have these differences across FIA regions I alluded to. I just stole this map out of Kevin Potter's presentation from earlier today because I wanted to highlight the difference in sample intensity for the invasive plots from south to north, and just thinking how much I wish we had that data for the north at the intensity that the south has it. Which indicators are included varies by region. The field-based indicators are not always on the same subsample. So, like the veg indicator and the invasives and the deer browse, they might be on different sets of subplots, or different subsets rather. As far as data sources, the ecosystem health indicators in FIA have a complicated structure where you have to know which ones are measured where. And so, that's a challenge. There's lots of other kinds of data sets, lots of examples we've seen in this conference. Maybe it's too many different options. That's what we need experts on all these things to advise us to which ones we should be using. And because the options are so unlimited for how you could apply these things. And then just wanted to highlight that for, at the beginning of the kind of FHM FIA integration, we had all these indicators, and we had an indicator lead in FIA that was sort of the champion of each one of those, would lead working groups to make changes or tweaks for moving forward to make these things more useful. The ones that are in bold are the ones that I think we kind of still have indicator advisors, maybe not with that name anymore. That whole kind of structure has kind of gone away with retirements and changes in the program, but it just opens up the maybe more opportunities for us, because if we think of these things as opportunities, we know partnerships and collaborations are the key to all this, and FIA needs help with a lot of these indicators. If we're going to keep moving forward, we're collecting a lot of data, but we don't really have people assigned as leaders of many of these topics anymore. And maybe that's an opportunity for FHM and other partners to step in and work with FIA. So I just tried to kind of leave it here as my last slide, and I can let Margaret take over, but I can bring this back up when we get to discussion time if it's helpful.
Sure. Thank you, Randy.
Okay, all good?
Yep, looks good.
Okay, great. So yeah, I just want to thank the conveners of this discussion. This is a really important topic. One that I'm excited about, and I hope that there'll be lots of advancement in this area in the near future, in the coming, let me get rid of these. Okay, so so I wanted to show this figure as taken out of a paper published in 2022 in Bioscience, co-first authored by myself and Justin DeRose, as sort of a place to start and sort of think about this idea of combining data streams to think about forest health. And I want to start actually over here. Can you see my mouse? Is that visible for you all?
Yes, we can
Yes.
see it.
Okay, great. I wanted actually to start over here, just the fact that forest systems are very complicated, and so there's a lot going on at the same time. The forest dynamics and forest health are impacted by climate and endogenous demographic processes, exogenous disturbances, harvest schedules, and other global change factors. So if we want to have any hope of parsing these apart, or attributing better understanding, better predicting, making better decisions about how to mitigate climate stress with management strategies, i.e., we need better understanding to make good management decisions. The sort of principle here is that we need to throw as much data at this problem of better understanding and predicting the system, throw as much data as possible at the same time. So that's this sort of, combining data streams is going to give us the ability to take on this complexity of these forest systems. This particular figure was taken from a paper where we're advocating for integrating two ground-based data streams, the FIA data, and then tree rings that are collected in a forest inventory context. And then using those together with wall-to-wall types of data, climate data products, remotely sensed data. And now only in the last few years, I've started to understand ADS data and NAPE data, these other aerial data, wall-to-wall products that I wasn't aware of at the time. So combining these data streams together, I think is the best hope that we have of getting a handle on the complexity and addressing the forest health issues that we're facing. And so in this slide, I just want to try to give you a sense of what we've been able to do in terms of combining these two data streams together. Just an example of combining tree ring and forest inventory data together. So this is a paper published in 2022 using a Bayesian state space model to fuse together tree ring and forest inventory data to quantify the drivers of tree level growth variability and characterizing uncertainties in our forecasts of future tree growth. And then this is Courtney Giepink created this climate sensitive version of FBS based on the combination of tree ring and forest inventory data in a frequentist framework. So it can be done, is my point, and just one small example of fusing these data streams together. In terms of opportunity, this is, I thought Donnie's talk was great. We're on the same, sort of, maybe it's a bandwagon, we can call it a bandwagon now, of people interested in improving the temporal resolution of detection of tree mortality, especially in the Western US with a 10-year remeasurement cycle. There's a lot of latency built into that panel design. And so in my group, we've been thinking about how can we combine FIA data with ADS data and NAPE imagery. And I just wanted to highlight this paper by Bill Monahan, where he's taken NAPE imagery data and then he's used a classification model to classify pixels into colors. So these are low resolution spectral data, classify them into red for unhealthy dying trees, green for healthy trees, red tones, spectrum, part of the spectrum for unhealthy dying trees, then gray for dead, and then black for shadow. So that's using the NAPE imagery data and that's, the NAPE imagery data are about every 2 years collected. So I've been in contact with Bill about the idea we have with a student, CC Martinez, who I think is in the group here, about combining these NAPE imagery with FIA data. And Bill gave us this email with this beautiful long list of Okay, so there's the opportunity, but the other side of it is there's a challenge here. And so this is a long list from Bill of the challenges involved in fusing together NAPE imagery and FIA data. So FIA plot locations are not perfectly known. There's error associated with that, and that spatial error is not very well quantified. I think there was another session I didn't get to see today where, is it Jacob Strunk was talking about the improved georeferencing of the plot centers for FIA that's going to overcome this particular challenge in this list. Then you have additional spatial error associated with deriving the subplot centers from the plot center. There's temporal misalignment between when a FIA plot was visited and the years that NAPE images are taken, and then also temporal mismatch in terms of what time of year those data are produced. And then the variable observation geometries and NAPE images. So you can see, this is a picture taken from a plane at a certain angle of that landscape. So depending on where on the angle that image is taken, that can create some error and variability in the data. And then understory trees are not visible in those NAPE images. You're really just getting the canopy trees. So that's a list of some of the characteristics of the data and sources of error and variability that you need to think about. And I guess my point is that fusing these different data sources together can be challenging because no data source is perfect. There's no data stream that's perfect. And our approach is to start working with this in a Bayesian Cox proportional hazards model, working with a statistician here at the University of Arizona. And this is my last slide. I just wanted to give some really high level sort of ideas about how do we do this? How do we fuse different data sources together? First of all, I'm not going to lie, it's not easy. So we just need to acknowledge this really is challenging to do this stuff and do it well. Number two thing that I think is really incredibly important, you need to know the data. And I thought Donnie did a beautiful job of showing those three types of data, FIA, ADS, and NAPE, or maybe it was something else. You need to know the spatial and temporal characteristics of the data, the extent and resolution, the scale. You need to think about the processes that generated the data. So he showed that map of the ADS surveys, the map that is the planes are flying. And so knowing the process that generates the data gives you a sense of sources of bias, sources of error or uncertainty, knowing the strengths and weaknesses in terms of the spatial and temporal extent and resolution. That's, like, what do you have to work with? What's the clay that you have to work with to kind of glob things together and make a nice sculpture? I also would really recommend, this is, work with people who are smarter than you. And by that, I mean people who know more about the data than I do, people who know more than I do about statistics, about, building sort of leading edge statistical models, people who know more about forests, the biometrics, biometricians, people who know that area, the history, disturbance ecology, et cetera. And then, support the people who are the engine of the work. In the context that I'm in, this is graduate students and postdocs. And in the context of, Forest Service, there's, more permanent staff. But I am aware that there are staffing and hiring issues within the Forest Service. And so getting this work done means, people who are in positions of leadership and decision-making and in the position to allocate money, we have to fight for the support for the people who are the engines of these data and the efforts that needs to be made to be able to merge them together. And then I'll just put in a plug for, doing this in a way that's robust, not a one and done, but like a reproducible workflow that, the next person can come in the next year and plug it and then do it again. There's a lot of robustness that goes into making sure your code is doing what it should be doing, testing that, and then having reality checks or gut checks with people who know the data in terms of what's coming out of the modeling tools that you're creating. With that, I will stop. I'm sure that was at least 5 minutes, so I'll stop there.
It was definitely 5 minutes. Thank you, Margaret. That was great. Frank, how about you?
Yep, I'm going to share some slides here. Okay, tell me you can see a slide with the picture of me. Very
Yep.
good. I'm just going to go right into it. And wondering, for those who don't know me, why I'm on this call. And you don't need to go through this whole list. The point of this list is just to say, look, I've been at this now. At the end of December, I've been doing this 20 years. I've been working in the forest health monitoring space at the national scale for 20 years, and increasingly it has become a continental endeavor. And the same sort of dilemmas that we see here in the US are kind of playing out everywhere. But anyway, let's get to the point of if I can get the slides to advance, that is. Okay. So here do I say these are just a few thoughts. I'm not going to go into great detail, just some things that I thought of from the prompts. In terms of untapped opportunities for integrating FIA and FHM expertise. Kind of what I've always wondered, and I think, I alluded to it maybe in my comments to people in the last session. We have this opportunity in front of us. Yeah, it is difficult to combine, to integrate things. And I guess I would start by saying, let's go and try to figure out where FIA and FHM data overlap. And I don't mean quantitatively. I don't mean where they're necessarily measuring exactly the same thing. And in fact, maybe it's better if they aren't measuring the same thing. They're measuring different angles. Figure out where those things overlap conceptually. And then I think there's a chance there to find synergies because we have this opportunity to look at things from multiple angles. And when they're contradictory, that's interesting. When they're confirmatory, that's interesting too. Pulling in external data sources, I don't think that's, Randy mentioned that. I think Margaret's talked about that too. Like, there's a lot of things with the forest health community. We're maybe not comfortable. We're not climatologists necessarily. But we have to not be afraid of what's unfamiliar. I definitely was nodding my head when Margaret said, work with people who are smarter than you are. That includes work with the people who are experts in the stuff that you want. And I don't think we need to be afraid of that. We are in this weird data-rich, increasingly data-richer world. Randy said, is it too much? Well, maybe, but, with cloud computing platforms, better AI algorithms all the time, we have these opportunities for multi-scale analyses. And by that, I mean looking at things at different temporal scales, looking at things at different spatial scales. That's always been an obstacle for us in FIA and FHM. Is like, hey, we have to serve this audience, or we have to serve these users, these decision makers, and we have to report on annual scale. And no, we have to report on a 10-year scale. Look, those aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, and I wish we didn't always act like they were. We have the resources to look at things across all those scales and thus suit different audiences. And the final thing is, I guess, kind of building on that, is why aren't we running toward AI in the FHM community? FIA too. FIA is doing better. We've got better sense of the tools. We'll always need human experts when it comes to forest health issues, but algorithms are better at finding patterns, elucidating trends, making predictions. That's what they're there for. So why don't we focus on what we think are the right interpretations rather than and let the robots do the hard work. So that's not anything new if you know me. These are the kinds of things I talk about. But so Dave, just to end it real quick, I'm gonna say, because Margaret already said, remember, perfect is the enemy of the good. Nothing's perfect, nothing's precious. Don't treat any data source as precious or as representing everything that you need, because it won't. And no analytical approach is going to solve all your problems. Standards and consistency are important, but at the end of the day, it's not the preciousness of those data streams, it's the utility for what your questions are. And the bigger one, and the one I guess that's been top of mind for me lately, is that when we talk about this stuff, I think that we just don't, we think we have a common language and vocabulary around forest health issues, but I'm afraid that we don't. And I'll give an example of, like, when we talk about indicators, well, what does that mean? Well, we have FIA's book, Forest Ecosystem Indicators, ecosystem health indicators. Well, those are indicators, but not really. They're data streams on which you can build indicators. So when I'm talking about an indicators framework and we're looking at this indicators book, are we really talking about indicators in the same way? That's just one small example. There's many other ways we don't talk in the same terms. And I think that would be a good place to start, is to figure out, hey, what are we talking about when we use these big words to describe what we do? And I'm going to stop there because I think that is enough. And you've heard plenty from me today.
Well, thank you very much, Frank, and thank you, Margaret and Randy, for your thoughts. So we have a great set of panelists here, and I would ask people, as they have questions that they want to throw at the panelists, either you can write them in the chat or you can raise your hand and we can call and you can ask them in person. I see Karen Schlieweiss wins the award for first question. So I'll go, it's in the chat already. I'll go ahead and read it out. And I think this actually builds on something Frank was already talking about. So what do you think is an acceptable amount of error in space, time, thematic? Yes, we all know challenges in data fusion, but how perfect it needs to be is application dependent. Should we aim for no error in products? Well-specified error and precision? How do we talk to users more about what's acceptable accuracy and precision?
I'm going to jump on that one. Just my gut reaction is that we just need to report that stuff. Like, we need to report the precision and, uncertainty, and then people get to do what they want with it. So as a starting point, I'll just throw that out there.
Great. Randy, Frank, do you have thoughts on that as well?
Yeah, I mean, appreciate the question, Karen. Look, I in the early days, I did a ton of work on uncertainty, identifying, characterizing it. And I think we do spend a lot of time trying to specify error. And I think that's noble, that's useful, but sometimes we might need to embrace the uncertainty. And by that, I mean, instead of getting hung up on what we don't know, we start to identify those things where we do feel certain, where our decision or our outcome is robust to those uncertainties. We may never be able to specify all the uncertainties, but there are certainly instances where we think we have an outcome or a decision and we can say, hey, look, we know this is going to happen this way in that place. So I guess I wouldn't say there's value in specifying error to a point, but at some point you cannot resolve all of your information gaps. You just simply can't. And you need to prioritize how do you make a decision based on sometimes severely uncertain information. And there's a lot of people who work on that stuff, maybe not so much in the forest health community, but that's where I would go, is in that direction. I don't know that clarifies anything, but Karen obviously threw us out there to, ruin my day late in the evening, but it's a good question.
I don't
Great.
have much to add on that one, Dave. I was thinking what Margaret said. I mean, I think we need to quantify and be transparent about our, accuracy and precision, but make it available and allow people to make their own decisions about when the data is useful for their particular application.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, Andy Lister threw a comment in. I won't read the whole thing, but it really boils down to that there's this gap between people producing data analyses and the people we want to end up using the information. Policymakers, decision makers, whatever they are. And so, I mean, I think to some extent, a comment maybe you all can sort of respond to that. Cultivating tech transfer tools that help people interact with the data would be a good investment. I mean, is that sort of last mile of getting it into the people who actually make decisions? Is that the challenge? Or is that one of the challenges that we need to think more carefully about?
I do think that is one of the important challenges. So, thinking back to the session and what was it? The forest invasive pests, sort of atlas or whatever it was, the spatial tool. There are managers on the ground who want these things to be, sort of real time and useful. And I guess, there's also an initiative right now to make FVS more user friendly, as a tool that can be used for carbon forecasting. So I think any forest health kind of tools that we talk about, or indicators, going that last mile and serving it up and making it really user friendly and usable in real time is definitely a desirable goal.
Yeah, Margaret, that makes me think. I think you're mentioning the Alien Forest Pest Explorer, and it is a challenge for us to keep that up to date, even with our in this case being the FIA piece of that. That's merging the FIA data stream with the pest ranges from FHM, and trying to keep both of those things up to date has been a challenge for us, and we have to now find resources to update it. And I think a nice maybe kind of intermediate between hosting a tool like that is to have expert curated data sets for people to use that distill the complicated FIA information to a pre-summarized level that people could maybe access it. And a good example, I think, is going to be presented, or maybe it was today. Kevin Potter and others that have been looking at wildland urban interface data and landscape context. They published a research data set recently that combines the FIA invasive plant information with forest fragmentation, landscape context metrics from remotely sensed data. And now folks can download that data, and if someone that's not an FIA or an FHM actually was building and maintaining those tools based on the data that we published, we would be more likely to be able to keep our data, up to date. And if somebody else is building that front end part that we seem to struggle to be able to keep up to date, that might be a good partnership or collaboration.
Yeah. So thinking of Andy's question, I think Andy hit on this. Sorry to pivot a little bit, but I think he hit on this. This is a sore spot for this inability to connect the data, the sort of wonkier sides of things to these sort of compelling forest health narratives. I think that's been a sore spot for FHM uppercase and FHM lowercase too. And I didn't really do the idea justice, but I think that there's a real need. Whatever we're doing here in terms of integration and harmonizing is try to keep those forest health narratives, like the interpretive piece. That's the value we can add from either FIA or FHM. That's what we can add that the data or an analysis can't do. We have to, and if we're going to do anything different, it's we got to provide narratives so that somebody doesn't, they don't have to focus on those technical details. The technical details matter a lot, but not to the narrative. The narrative has to, the forest health narrative in whatever place, whatever the phenomenon is that you're tracking, that has to be the most important point. And I don't know, been at this 20 years and I feel like we've had this same, or we've had the same dilemma the whole time. So I don't know that I have a good solution. I hope that we move more and more or devote some big portion of our effort to getting those narratives out there so that people can really focus on what matters.
Yeah, thank you. I think also related, Sarah brought up, building off of Randy's comment and maybe going back to that connection, if the tools curate data sets, we need to update them in the future. Is it better just to publish the existing thing or publish the reproducible workflows and try and find someone else who can turn that crank? Or, what is that strategy sort of once we do that initial development and move it into a tech transfer form? If I read between the lines a little bit in Sarah's question.
You said it better than I did. Thank you.
Well, if I could just jump in, this makes me think of what Grant Domke's group has to do. They have to turn the crank every year with forest carbon reporting to EPA. And so after turning that crank a certain number of years, like they've gotten good at it, like they've gotten this to a sort of relatively efficient and reproducible thing that they turn the crank again, and they produce those numbers each year. And maybe it's just that other programs haven't been forced to do that, and so maybe lessons could be learned from from the forest carbon group.
Um, yeah, and I think, yeah. So to Margaret's point, I think we probably should look at all the people out there who do things. I think FIA is really good, in fact, at turning the crank. They have done a lot more. I think Eric's on here. He'll tell you FHM has not been great at turning the crank. We have not developed that. But there is part of me, Sarah, for your question, part of me is like open science is, that's the way we should go. So the notion of having reproducible methodologies that someone else can go in and do it, and maybe they'll do it better, or maybe they'll notice something that we didn't notice. Like I'm like, boy, I feel like that's the way we should go, but there is that issue of I mean, I'm a science, you're a scientist, I'm a scientist for an agency, and we have mandates. FIA has to report so often, FHM has to report so often. And so there is that tension. But if I was going to lean in any direction, methodology, reproduce it, put it out there, give people access to the most update data, and more importantly, tell them how you did it, and hey, this is how you could do it. If you got something better, let me know. That's the way I would love it to go.
Yeah, and maybe this is related to that. It's something I was thinking about. I think especially during Randy's comments, when he was talking about, here's all these areas that we used to have expertise in, and now, like, whatever, a third or a quarter of them, he has someone he can point to within FIA, and it makes me wonder, Forest Service R&D, we've over 20 years we've lost an amazing amount of capacity, and it's not obvious that that direction is going to turn around quickly if it does turn around. Um, so that raises prioritization and deprioritization as part of this conversation, which is especially challenging when we think of like developing new methods and figuring out who turns the crank and how you keep these things going. We keep developing all these new things at the same time that we have reducing capacity. It just seems like in that environment, how do we define priorities? And we can start as the researcher themselves. Like, you don't necessarily need to talk to the organization because I think it's a different level of conversation. But just as a researcher and someone who wants to do good work and get it in the hands of people who do it, like how do we prioritize it in that environment?
Yeah, it's with an awareness of the shrinking permanent staff within Forest Service R&D on the decadal scale that I added that point about supporting the people who do the work. Like R&D can't do more stuff if it has fewer and fewer people each year. And so, for me in the university context, I'm fighting for funding for graduate students and postdocs. But people within Forest Service, are fighting for support for these positions to do this work. And it's a fight that never goes away. Yeah.
Yeah, Dave, that's it. I don't know, man. It could be, you could have a very bleak interpretation of your question. Um, Margaret's right. Hey, we all need to support. I would point to Margaret, say, like, I think the agency looks, at least Forest Service R&D is looking more and more towards external. I mean, I think a lot of us within R&D, we feel two pressures. One is get more funding. I have more calls to go and seek external funding outside of R&D dollars to support our work than ever. And the other is they are expecting us now to lean on uh, the universities, lean on someone like Margaret, and that's great. And I'm sure Margaret embraces the opportunity, but it costs money. So, like, I feel like the squeeze, Dave, is kind of coming in two, kind of coming from two angles. I don't know the answer to it other than to say, let's keep doing great work and network like this. This is the only way to make. I think this is probably our only chance is to keep our heads above water. Is to all of us help keep the raft afloat. So more things like this and more advocacy for each other.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for the thoughts on that. Andy threw another topic in there, which I'm going to see
He rolled another grenade into the room. Is that
Frank
what you're
laughing.
saying?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we have a new administration coming into office, and there's always, um, I'll still avoid using the exact terminology that Andy used just to annoy him. But should we still be beating the drum on carbon? What should we turn dials towards ecosystem services, economic potential? I mean, I think it kind of comes down to maybe another way to put it is how we sort of frame and package the work we do so that it seemed as relevant as possible to the people in power, and how much we do that versus how much we stick to the sort of being consistent and going back to sort of Frank's comment about language, like changing our vocabulary every 4 years probably only causes more problems with what Frank was talking about. Not so. I don't know if anyone wants to sort of address that.
I have a very disorganized thought, somewhat related to that. If you noticed on my slide, I had this big list of what I have been calling indicators, and Frank rightly points out that really, for it to be an indicator, it needs to be tracking a trend over time, not just be a single metric. But a lot of those things on the list used to be very important in FHM, things like lichens and ozone indicator damage and air quality and things like that. But for the past few years, in FHM settings, it's really been a lot about tree mortality, carbon sequestration, bugs and crud, pests and disease is always a big FHM topic. And then invasive plants have been, hearing more about invasive plants in the past few years, but a lot of the things on that sort of indicator list don't come up as often in the FHM setting. And I'm not trying to suggest we need to like slice a whole bunch of data collection off of FIA, but in the context of us talking about shrinking budgets and shrinking staffs and things like that, it just came to my mind that we're collecting a lot of data, and if we don't have expertise in those topic areas anymore, and FHM isn't taking that data and running with it, we need to find some new partners or something.
Could I ask a historical question? This is just, I'm going to reveal my ignorance of the history of FHM. So somebody said that it was sort of born in the 1980s in New England. Is this in response to acid rain and like concern about, okay,
I
gotcha.
think
That makes
was
sense.
the very, very beginning of it. Yeah.
Gotcha. I mean, it does sort of make sense that you would want to have two monitoring programs. Like if you think at a national scale, you want one that's sort of rigid and inflexible and homogeneous, and we're always doing the same thing no matter what. And then you want another system that's really responsive to what's happening now in the forest. And then in the 1980s, it was acid rain. And that's why you got ozone and lichens and, all this stuff. And nowadays, there's just, a ton of invasive species. And yeah, the deer browse is interrupting regeneration. And yeah, so like it would make sense. You would want a two-level design for monitoring, one that's more responsive and flexible, and one that's less responsive and really consistent, spatially and temporally. So you have the perfect design. It's just
We haven't worked on it. Like it's just what it was,
Yeah.
we're just still going along. So I guess that's what I'm getting at, is that if we had the resources to like have a real working group to kind of see what kind of tweaks should be made.
right. Yeah. And I mean, is it time to let go of the lichens and the ozone in the places where acid
Right,
rain?
I should clarify. Ozone has been retired for quite some time, and I think
Oh,
lichens is
okay.
only.
Gotcha.
I picked like the most egregious example. That's fine.
Don't
Right.
pick on lichens or anything.
I
No.
love lichens. I have
No.
a giant lichens book right here.
But
But it's only in the P&W now, I think.
yeah. So I think Margaret, other part of that history, just to sort of carry it forward, is I do think it is a good design to have something that looks at something that is a system, a monitoring system. If we were going to say FIA's plot design, if we're going to say that, what do we call it? Is it phase 2? Whatever. Sorry, kids are decided to get a little busy behind me. But we have these two systems, and FIA is this rigid systematic. It's great, and FHM has never been that. It's not wall to wall. It's very targeted. But I think the biggest issue is, and like Randy said, we've just been going along. I think that FIA has a research structure behind it that helps push it along. FHM has it doesn't really fully sit in R&D. It mostly sits state, private, and tribal forestry because Forest Health Protection picked it up when the EPA walked away from forest health monitoring back in the early 90s. Um, so I think if we're going to sort of exploit these sort of two monitoring systems together, we would be it would be good to sort of build up and sort of connect the research capacity that is in FIA and other parts of R&D and just sort of like help FHM on the research side. I think that would probably be like that's one of those untapped opportunities maybe is to get it that way. Because right now my team of 5 people, 6 people soon, we just don't have the bandwidth to push it in the way that FIA can be pushed.
Yeah, and I see also this kind of relates, but Andy kind of asked again these sort of different visions of kind of different structures and different components of monitoring and how they're targeted. And then, he asked essentially, is it best to fuzzily quantify forest health at large scales or focus on specific stand types and forest health complexes with focused research? And maybe what I'm hearing from you all is it's both, really. I mean, is that kind of what you were all saying? It's really both those aspects. It's just how do we get there?
I mean, yes. I mean, my team has a specific mandate to look at forest health monitoring issues at a national scale. Very little of the FHM machine is directed in that way, but we do an annual report. Like that's something that is expected of us. So, yes. So I think we're always going to have to do it at this national sort of broad scale, a little fuzzier. But boy, it would be great if it was better connected to fine scale research. So yeah, short answer, yes, we should be doing both. How we make that work is probably beyond my pay grade.
If you don't mind, I'll jump in with a question to build off Frank's comment. I think it came up earlier from Randy too. Is that we have some structures, and FIA has science group, this group, the users group. You organize yourself in bands, if I'm correct. FHM has a management team, has some regional networks we're building. We actually have a working group. I think the terrible name. I'm not even sure what it means. It's called High Dog. But anyway, it is a place for FIA and FHM to work together through some of these issues. But I was just kind of curious from your perspectives. How do we? That's all within the Forest Service for the most part. How do we have these conversations in a way that can build towards some of these concrete questions we're asking? Any thoughts on how we use some current structures, or need to build some new connectors to other networks to keep this going, or any thoughts on that?
We've held sessions like these at the annual FHM working groups where some of the state cooperators and such in the forest health kind of arena attend. And so that would be seems like the right venue that would have even broader of an audience than this particular, this call we're on now. But yeah, restarting High Dog is an obvious place to start. And I think I heard Erin Berryman's coming back. But I don't know if that's true. Maybe I shouldn't have said that, but
She is.
okay, that's good. And I know Eric and Sue Crocker and myself had talked about, getting that group back, meeting again to start talking about these issues. But I agree. We should open it up to our university and other collaborators that are interested in these data streams and products.
I
Yeah.
definitely
Go ahead,
don't.
Margaret.
Oh, I don't have an answer to how it should be done, but I really hope that it can be done. Because I think those conversations need to continue and develop. I was just going to say also, I think FIA, sort of stumbling forward, maybe not a whole lot, I mean, they became national scale in 2000 or 2001. I think there's still some degree to which there's still regional differences, and I think they're not that much far ahead of the curve compared to FHM or FHP. But maybe just, sort of trying to have these conversations to be intentional about, we have these two systems. How can we make them really complementary and emphasize this aspect of this system and this aspect of this system, and make, the forest health monitoring more nimble and responsive to, what's happening on the ground, and producing products that, address those sort of immediate things as they're coming up. And serving up, I guess, sort of knitting back to thoughts earlier in this conversation, serving up products that people on the ground can use, that last mile conversation we were talking about.
So it looks like we have 3 minutes left. And so I want to give each of our panelists, just a brief bit of time to sort of, if you have any last thoughts for this group. I think this is kind of your opportunity to throw those out into the space, and yeah. Maybe I'll start with Randy if he has any last thoughts he wants to throw out there.
Sure. I'm thinking about the turning the crank conversation, and would say grants group's a great example of taking FIA data and turning the crank and producing this other data set and report mechanism. FIA is really good at turning the crank for our kind of standard NFI, publishing the FIA database and the tools necessary to make population estimates. But when it comes back to these FHM variables and the suites, I'll call them suites of data instead of indicators, Frank, if that sounds better.
Families.
That crank has never been built yet, let alone ready to turn. Like the evaluations are like being built into the database, but to make a population estimate of some of these variables, you have to use different expansion factors and everything for each one of them based on which sample you have, and none of the the queries or any of that stuff is, I mean, there is some documentation out there for how to do it, but we haven't really started to turn a crank to produce any monitoring data for a whole lot of those things, or at least a good portion of those things, and haven't really been touched in quite some time. So there's a lot of opportunity that exists to bring in new and much more talented and smarter people than I to take these things and start to build new useful data and products.
Thanks, Randy. Margaret, do you have last thoughts? And then I'll move on to Frank last.
Yeah, I'll be really brief because I think I kind of gave maybe a last thought just before then. I love the way that we kind of zeroed in on partnerships, as given the challenges of staffing and getting the money to support the people to do the work, both within the federal agencies and within other universities. My own university went through a huge financial crisis within the last 12 months, and so money is really tight at my institution. So weathering these, changes of administration, sort of ups and down in institutions by partnering and, trying to work with each other, I think is hopefully a way forward.
Thanks, Margaret. Frank?
Well, I see we're at time, so I don't really have anything to add. I think Margaret's right. I think that's partnerships are where we're going. I do think it's conspicuous that if you look at the attendees, we didn't really have anyone outside of Eric. Maybe Liz was here, me. It's like not so much from the forest health protection side of the FHM community. Now I get it. This isn't their venue for what they do, but that kind of issues shows what the challenge is, and the most immediate way to get around that is to lean towards, as a head towards the partnerships. And I will only close by saying FIA may not be that much further along than FHM, but I mean, for example, the eValidator API is the best it's ever been. Fiesta, like what now we're gonna have like a standalone application, right? Like a web application as opposed to using it in the R. Yeah, I mean, there are definitely great examples coming from the FIA side that we can look at, but partnerships are gonna be the way forward. It has to be. It's just no other way. It's too big a ship to turn otherwise.
Yeah. Well, with that, I want to thank our three panelists. Thank you very much for offering your thoughts and opinions. I think this was a great discussion. I want to thank Eric and Sarah, my co-organizers, and I want to thank all the participants today. I think it probably gives Sarah and Eric a lot to think about and how to sort of keep a conversation like this moving forward. And so with that, especially for the East Coasters, have a good evening, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.